After the War of 1812, the United States went through something that happens only after wars, pretty much, a period of nationalism. Nationalism means doing what's best for the country rather than for your region or your economic interest. Americans are perennially concerned about their own economic interests. This isn't a critique of Americans. It's just a fact. That's why 4% of the world's population controls almost 25% of the world's economy. Money is just incredibly important in the United States, and Americans are good at making money. So this period of nationalism, people were doing what's best for the nation as a whole, and it'll only last about 4 years. Because in a country as big as the United States, nationalism just can't last that long. And by 1819, it will start to disintegrate. By 1824, it will be completely over. Now, there are several examples of nationalism and several factors that were leading to nationalism. And part of it was the United States had just won a war against England. Won a war, got a capital burned down, but the United States had a couple of victories. Small victories, but ultimately it was a draw. The thing that made this period of nationalism possible, though, was the economy was doing incredibly well. And there are a lot of examples of it. Two that are important, especially for the future. One is cotton, and cannot stress this enough. It's really important that you know that cotton is the #1 most important natural resource in the world throughout a lot of the 1800s. Not just cotton either, cotton from the United States South. The southern United States is the only part you can grow cotton in. And they are producing, in the southern states, the most important crop in the entire world. It's like oil in the 20th and 21st centuries. And it's what sugar had been in like the 1700s. In the 1800s, it is cotton from the United States South. And that is what the entire southern economy is based on. That's why when people say the Civil War is about slavery, you cannot separate slavery and cotton. Cotton is the most important natural resource in the world, and there's no machines to pick it up, pull it up, and everyone wants it. So the South will be based more and more on cotton, which means it'll be based more and more on slavery. You cannot separate those two things. So that is one thing that's making the economy do so well, is more cotton is being produced. The other thing is the rest of the country is developing more. There is a transportation revolution going on. Make sure to read about that in the notes. And that is fundamentally important in changing the United States. It'll be the same with cars and railroads later on. The United States is so big, transportation is absolutely essential. And so there's a transportation revolution, and the economy was just advancing. And went into a market economy, and it started going into an industrial economy, or mass production. Now, this is the first industrial revolution that's taking place during this period, and it's centered in England. England will be the center of the first industrial revolution. The second industrial revolution, that'll take place at the last 1/3 of the 1800s, and it is centered on the United States and Germany. That's when the United States becomes the world superpower. So the economy is building up, and the United States is getting into industrialism. But the problem is the British have much better manufacturing. So during the War of 1812, the United States, it started producing more industries. And after the War of 1812 ended, England was going to send all of its goods into the United States, which would destroy these American companies. This is bad for industry and manufacturing mean the same thing. This is bad for the United States. If the United States is going to become economically stronger, it has to have manufacturing. Luckily for, manufacturing, that's just in the North. The South will have virtually no manufacturing. And if the United States is going to get stronger, it needs to protect this. And luckily for the United States, for the future of the United States, During the War of 1812, the Republican Party, it fundamentally changed. Republicans, since the beginning of its creation as a party, had been for small to no military, no taxes, and a government as small as possible. Well, Madison got to experience the consequences of he and Jefferson's own policies, and it had been a disaster in the War of 1812. So after the war ended, in his State of the Union address, he actually called for, take a look what he called for. He called for improved fortifications, permanent army and a strong navy, a new national bank, protective tariffs, internal improvements. That means the government help building roads, using its money to build roads and canals. All those things there are exactly what Hamilton had called for. And all those things are things that Madison himself had opposed. Madison even said about small government, however wise the theory may be which leaves to the sagacity and interest of individuals the application of their industry and resources, there are in this, as in other cases, exceptions to the general rule. So what he's saying there is, like, the idea of the government being small, it is leaving people alone is a good idea, but there are exceptions. And you have to give Madison credit for this. He's not ideological. Some people, they'll just stick with their ideology no matter what. And the thing about political ideologies, I can guarantee you, is none of them have been true all the time. No party is always right, and no political ideology is always right. It's not saying small government is not right some of the time, but in this case, it didn't work. And the consequences, the long-term consequences, were just fairly negative. So the Republican Party changed, and they started calling for everything the Federalists had been calling for. So because of this, they'll pass a protective tariff in 1816. Southerners had been viscerally opposed to a protective tariff. The United States had had other tariffs before it. This is the first one that's actually protective. When I say protective, I mean it's high enough to discourage foreign countries' manufacturing to be sold into the United States. So we've talked about tariffs before, and there's different levels of them. Revenue tariff, we talked about revenue tariff. This is a protective tariff. So with a protective tariff, or without a protective tariff, English or British-made shoes are high quality and they're cheap because they have the best manufacturing in the world. American companies that make shoes, for example, their shoes are not as good, so worse quality and more expensive. So which one are you going to buy? Of course, the British shoes, which helps the British companies. Well, if the federal government puts a protective tariff of $1 or $2, then that British shoe, so that's how tariffs normally work. Any goods of foreign nations coming to the United States have tariffs put on them. Back in the 80s and 90s, it was like Japanese cars, especially in the 70s and 80s. It was Japanese cars in the 90s. I'm just using shoes as an example, but if a high-quality British shoe that was $2 has a $2 protective tariff, now it's $4, and that American shoe is $3, Americans are probably going to buy the $3 shoe. So, tariffs are insanely controversial, and they get more and more controversial as we get closer to the Civil War. And the reason they're controversial is because who are tariffs good for? Anyone that owns a manufacturing company. They're good for the United States overall because the United States still needs manufacturing at this time. Doesn't mean tariffs are good all the time because they are definitely not. So it's good for the country as a whole to get stronger. It's also good for manufacturers who are all in the north. The south didn't have hardly any manufacturing. It won't have very much manufacturing. All this means for Southerners is they're going to have to pay more. Protective tariffs are bad for consumers, or us, the people buying stuff. So Southerners will almost always oppose the tariff. What's amazing about the tariff of 1816 is it was supported by Southerners, especially this guy right here, Captain Crazy, John C. Calhoun. We'll talk about him more later. He will become the chief proponent of the South end of slavery. Most of our pro-slavery arguments come from John C. Calhoun. At this time, he was an all-out nationalist because he wants to be president. He is from South Carolina, the most southern, the most southern state leading up to the Civil War. But he is one that proposed the legislation for the tariff. Southerners, this is once in a generation thing. Southerners will not support a protective tariff after this. But that tells you how nationalistic the country was as a whole. Southerners supported this one, first protective tariff, and it passed. Southerners also supported a new Bank of the United States. The first Bank of the United States, if you remember, it was chartered for 20 years. Jefferson had let it expire in 1811, or Madison let it expire in 1811, and it was an economic disaster because I'm not going to go into it, but you need to have a federal banking system. You need to have, it's not a federal, but the federal government has a role in regulating the banking system. And every time we have not had one, that is when the economy has so much problem. And so Madison realized it was necessary, so a new Bank of the United States was created. It's just like the first one, but it was much bigger, and also it's chartered for 20 years. Don't ask me why they keep chartering for 20 years, because this is an issue 20 years from now. We'll get to it later, but during this period of nationalism, even Southerners supported this, and Calhoun will be the one that introduced the legislation. Southerners hate banks, as a generalization. Southerners generally despise them. But they supported this one. A lot of Americans will also support internal improvements. The federal government helping to use its money to build roads and canals. It's good for the country as a whole. Today that's what we call infrastructure. Same thing. All three of these things, protective tariff, Bank of the United States, and internal improvements, all three of these things at this time prove good. Protective tariffs stop being good for the economy like 1920s, probably earlier than that. But don't worry. But at this time, those three policies together will make the United States stronger. And they were mostly supported by this guy right here, Henry Clay, and you must know Henry Clay. He is one of the greatest politicians the United States has ever produced. The original founding father generation, Hamilton was the most economically brilliant during that period. Henry Clay is the most brilliant economic mind of the Jacksonian era. He is one of the best politicians the United States has ever had, because he doesn't just represent the best economic theory of the time, he also represents the art of compromise, which that's what politics is compromise. In a nation as big as the United States, as diverse, 332 million people, you have got to be able to compromise. And that is what he will run on, is the American system. Those three policies, and he's absolutely brilliant. He'll run for president 3 times, and he will lose every single time, because he has a clear-cut issue with clear-cut platforms, and you don't want to have clear-cut issues in politics if you want to win the presidency. I promise you. So, the point is, though, the Republican Party, they are now supporting things that they hadn't supported before because of nationalism. All Americans are. So that's one. There's economic nationalism. There's also political nationalism. The Republican Party changed, so they started adopting everything the Federalists need. So the Federalists, they're really a pointless party by the end of the War of 1812. And that will best be demonstrated by the presidency of James Monroe. Monroe is the last of the founding father presidents, and it's called the Forrest Gump of the presidents, because he's like the guy that was everywhere. He worked for Washington in the American Revolution. He was a law clerk for Jefferson, and then he was Secretary of State and War for Madison. So he's just everywhere. All the important places he just happens to be. He ushers in what's called the era of good feelings. And it's called the era of good feelings because we go through a period in U.S. history where we only have one party. And it's only happened this once. We only have one party in the United States. So in 1816, right after the War of 1812, the Federalists, they just get hammered. They only get 16%. By 1820, James Monroe will run completely unopposed. There is only one party, and it's the Republican Party, Democratic Republican Party. Now, the Democratic Republican Party was the only party. Monroe still did not win unanimously. George Washington is the only president to do that. I've heard people say one elector threw their vote away to make sure Washington had the distinction of being the only president elected unanimously. That's not true. The elector in New Hampshire, he genuinely thought John Quincy Adams would be a better president. But that tells you there's political nationalism, only having one party. The thing that Monroe was especially good at was pulling together the best and the brightest of the next generation of leaders. And one of them was John C. Calhoun. Take a look at that picture. That's John C. Calhoun at his very best. I'm not just picking on him because he was so pro-slavery, but he gets crazier and crazier looking with time. He gets just more intense. It's funny. John C. Calhoun was made Secretary of War in Monroe's cabinet, and at the time he was an all-out nationalist, wanted to be president, and he was brilliant. Also, the most successful Secretary of State. Remember, Secretary of State deals with foreign policy. That's what Jefferson was. That's what Hillary Clinton was. That's what Mike Pompeo was in the Trump administration. John Quincy Adams is the best Secretary of State the United States has ever had. As Secretary of State, he deals with foreign policy, and he did an amazing job as Secretary of State. And I'll give you two examples really quick. And I'm not going to go into all the details, so make sure to read them. As Secretary of State, he had to deal with two issues, and one of them was Florida. So Spain owed Florida. The United States owns everything around it. Spain owned it, but didn't control it. So it was mostly, they only had 3 cities. Spain only had 3 cities, and it was mostly where Native Americans were, and also runaway slaves. Runaway slaves and Native Americans would run into Florida. They'd live in Florida. They raid into the United States and then run back into Florida as if they were untouchable because they're in a foreign country. And they were treated actually like they're untouchable. So this got to be a big enough problem that the Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun, was told to deal with it. So Calhoun sent Andrew Jackson from the Battle of New Orleans into Florida, and he had the right for, quote, hot pursuit, and also to, quote, terminate the conflict, which means you can, hot pursuit, enter Florida and terminate the conflict, kill them all. All the Indians and runaway slaves that were raiding. Jackson, being Jackson, decided I could do that, or I could take Florida. And we know Jackson sent a letter to James Monroe that said, hey, if you want me to take Florida, just send me a letter saying yes, I will do it, and you can act like it was just my idea. And I'm paraphrasing, of course. And now, Jackson insisted to the end of his life that he got a letter. There is no evidence we got a letter. But at the same time, we know Jackson sent Monroe the letter, and if you're the President of the United States and you get a letter from someone like Andrew Jackson saying, hey, I'm about to go take this attack a foreign country, you should say no if you don't want them to. And Monroe was smart enough, he would have known this. So the fact that there's no proof that Jackson got a letter, and there's a lot of evidence that Monroe never sent a letter. Jackson, he invaded Florida. He took Florida, teared through there, killed some British because he found British soldiers and he just executed them. He hated British soldiers. We'll get to that later. And then after being there for a while, he just left. And the way the United States found out about this, Spain, the Spanish diplomat, every country sends diplomats to other countries. And Spain's diplomat in the United States, he came and visited John Quincy Adams, America's Secretary of State, at like 1 a.m, just pounding on his door, like, what is going on? Your guy just came and tore through Florida and just executed some people. And so now there's a diplomatic crisis. This is a diplomatic crisis for the United States. And everyone in Monroe's cabinet, everyone said, we should disavow Jackson and throw him under the bus, especially John C. Calhoun. And keep this in mind. Calhoun, this will come back to bite him. John C. Calhoun especially, because he was the one that put Jackson in charge, he was more responsible. So he said, let's throw him under the bus. Even the former presidents, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, they're alive, and they all said throw him under the bus. The one person that dissented was John Quincy Adams. And John Quincy Adams, this is how good he was. He said, just step back, let me take care of this. He goes to the diplomat in Florida and says, here's Florida back, but just know, this is your fault. You are supposedly the owner of that large territory, and it has runaway slaves and Native Americans attacking into the United States, and you need to get control of it. And if you can't get control of it, this might happen again, and it'll be your fault. If you can't get control of it, you might want to give it to someone that can. And John Quincy Adams took such a tough stance that it led to, it's called many names, Adams and Onis Treaty, the Spanish diplomat was Onis. It's also called the Transcontinental Treaty, or just the Florida Purchase Act, Florida Purchase Treaty. It did two things. One, the United States acquired Florida. So this is when the United States took control of Florida, and it also drew a boundary between the United States and Spain. That's why it's called the Transcontinental Treaty. That was the boundary that was separating the United States from Spain. So this was a huge victory for the United States, and it was all because of John Quincy Adams. Another victory that he has is called the Monroe Doctrine. Read about this in your notes. Countries of Central and South America, they all become independent. They had revolutions like the American Revolution, and European countries were thinking about coming back in. England and the United States were supposed to issue a joint statement saying, no, you can't. But John Quincy Adams said, no, if we give a statement with England, everyone will respect England and we'll look really weak. We'll make the United States look weak. And he was absolutely right. That's how diplomacy works. It would be more candid as well as more dignified to avow principles explicitly to Russia and France, than to come in as a cockboat in the wake of British man of war. A cockboat is a rowboat. So because of John Quincy Adams, the United States issued the Monroe Doctrine alone. This is a fundamental staple of U.S. foreign policy. When you talk about what are the most important principles of U.S. foreign policy in its history, and there are people that just major in this, U.S. foreign policy, one of them, isolation, from George Washington's farewell address. 2, neutrality, because the United States has the luxury of being protected by the Atlantic and the Pacific. That's why it's so hard to invade if people wanted to. And 3, the Monroe Doctrine. It said European nations are not allowed to intervene in the American hemisphere or the Western hemisphere or try to colonize it anymore. And the United States will stay out of Europe's affairs. And this is largely upheld. Make sure you know the Monroe Doctrine, because when you take the second half of U.S. history, you have to learn about Teddy Roosevelt will make a change to it. The United States will stick with this. The United States stays out of European wars until World War I. And it also makes sure that European nations stay out of the American hemisphere. These are both great victories for the United States, and they are both because of John Quincy Adams.